Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will explore and attempt to resolve the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 29. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter. And each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 29, the top 3 issues are the meaning of verse 7, the syntactic function of the phrase Kol Adonai, which occurs 7 times in this psalm, and the meaning of verse 9a. The first issue is the meaning of verse 7. The King James Version translates this verse as, "The voice of the Lord divideth the flames of fire." This is also how the ancient translators understood this verse. Divide is also the gloss which the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon gives for the verb in this verse. But what would it mean to divide flames of fire? The Brown Driver Briggs lexicon suggests that it means the thunder of his voice sends forked lightnings. So flames of fire refers to lightning, and the dividing of the flames of fire refers to sending out or flashing forth the lightning. This view is represented by most modern translations, which say something like, "The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire," or "The voice of the Lord makes the lightning flash." Some other translations do reflect different interpretations. The JPS 1917 translation, for example, says, "The voice of the Lord heweth out flames of fire." Others, like the NIV, read, "The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning." The Hebrew text of Psalm 29:7 reads, "Kol Adonai chotsev lahavot esh." There are 2 questions here that the different translations are wrestling with. The first question is, what is the meaning of the verb chotsev? Is it divide, hew, flash forth, or strike? And the second question is, what is the syntactic function of the phrase lahavot esh? Is it the direct object of the verb, or is it adverbial? We'll look at both of these questions, each one at a time. First, what is the meaning of the verb chotsev? When we look at how this word is used elsewhere in the Bible, we find that it almost always means to hew out, or to mine. It can refer to hewing out dressed stones, hewing out bronze, a well, hewing out a grave, a winepress, hewing out the pillars of a house. And when the participle chotsev functions like a noun, it refers to a miner. According to the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, the verb chatsav refers to an action by which humans strike an object repeatedly with an axe, chisel, or other sharp implement in order to alter its shape and so create a new object out of it. And SDBH gives the glosses to hew out, to dig, to cut out, to dress, to mine. This is why some translations, for example the JPS 1917 translation, translate this verb here as hew out. But if this is the normal meaning of the verb, then why do so many other translations, including the ancient translations, have something different, like divide or flash forth? The problem is that the normal meaning of the verb, hew out or mine, is difficult to make sense of. What would it mean to hew out flames of fire, or to hew out with flames of fire? By contrast, dividing flames of fire can refer to the flashing forth of lightning, which makes good sense amidst the thunderstorm imagery that pervades this psalm. And this interpretation, divide, is supported by all the ancient translations. And even if chatsav doesn't have this meaning elsewhere, related Hebrew roots like chatzah and chatav can mean divide or to split. But the big problem with this view is that chatsav never means divide, but always hew out or mine. Now there is at least one example where it means strike, as the NIV and Net Bible translate it. But the basic and most frequent meaning of the verb is hew out or mine, and we suggest that this common meaning of the verb makes the best sense in Psalm 29:7. Mining is something done in the mountains. Deuteronomy 8:9, for example, talks about mining bronze from the mountains. Umeharareha tachtzov nechoshet. It can hardly be a coincidence that in Psalm 29, the verse right before verse 7 mentions mountains, Lebanon and Sirion. The contextual domain of mountains is thus active in the reader's mind when they come to verse 7 and encounter the word chotsev, which often refers to hewing out stone from mountains. Another contextual domain which is associated with the act of hewing or mining is that of construction or building. In 1 Kings 5, for example, we read about Solomon gathering materials to build the temple. One verse mentions people going into the forests of Lebanon to gather wood, and then the very next verse mentions, quote, stonecutters in the hill country, chotsev bahar. Similarly, in Psalm 29, the word chotsev in verse 7 follows shortly after the mention of the cedars of Lebanon in verse 5. That the verb chotsev occurs in the context of mountains and in the context of the cedars of Lebanon strongly suggests that it has its normal meaning of mining or hewing stone for the purpose of building something. But this brings us to the second part of this issue, the syntactic function of the phrase lahavot esh, which most understand to mean lightning bolts. The clause makes the most sense if we understand lahavot esh, lightning bolts, not as the direct object, the Lord hews out lightning bolts, but as an adverbial accusative. The Lord hews out stone with lightning bolts. The argument for this view is as follows. First, the act of hewing or mining usually involves a sharp instrument, usually a pickaxe. It's likely that in Psalm 29 we're meant to imagine that the sharp instrument for hewing is not a pickaxe, but lightning bolts. The image here is similar to some Ugaritic texts and icons in which the god Baal is depicted as wielding lightning as a weapon. And this point ties in with a third point, that the noun lehava, flame, can actually refer to the head of a spear, as in 1 Samuel 17:7. For these reasons, it's best to understand the flames of fire, or the lightning bolts, as the sharp instrument with which the Lord hews stone in the mountains. Now, it's true that there's no bait preposition that marks this phrase explicitly as the instrument, as adverbial. But it's not uncommon in Hebrew for adjuncts that are normally marked with bait to occur without it, the so-called adverbial accusative. And some have suggested that the bait has been omitted here because the previous word, chotsev, ends with bait. For all these reasons, we've interpreted chotsev to mean hew or mine, and the phrase lahavot esh as an adverbial accusative. The sound of the Lord hewing with lightning bolts. If we were to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale from A to D, A being the highest, D the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. There's another phrase in verse 7 that needs to be discussed, a construct phrase that means the voice of the Lord, or the sound of the Lord. The word kol can mean either voice or sound. This phrase occurs 7 times in this psalm, once in verse 3, twice in verse 4, once in verse 5, once in verse 7, once in verse 8, and once in verse 9. Modern translations generally agree that the phrase means the voice of the Lord, and that it functions as the subject of each clause in which it occurs. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The voice of the Lord hews with lightning bolts, and so on. Some of the oldest translations of this psalm, however, for example the Septuagint, understood the phrase not as the subject of these clauses, but as a sentence fragment, as an exclamation. The sound of the Lord who breaks the cedars. The sound of the Lord who hews with lightning bolts. According to this translation, the breaking of cedars and the hewing of stone are not things that the Lord's voice does, but that the Lord does, specifically things that the psalmist hears the Lord doing. As you can tell by our translation, this is how we understand the phrase to be functioning in the first 5 of its occurrences. Then, in the last 2 occurrences of the phrase, verses 8 to 9, the syntax is different, and Kol Adonai is the subject of the clauses. Because our view of this phrase is not well represented among modern translations, we want to take the time to lay out the evidence for our view so that you can decide for yourself whether or not you think it is compelling. Hebrew grammars recognize that construct phrases beginning with kol sometimes have this function. For example, according to the grammar by Juan and Muraoka, quote, the word kol, voice, sound, followed by a genitive is quite often used as an exclamatory particle, the sound of. Look for example at 1 Kings 18:14. Go up, eat and drink, for the sound of the noise of rain, ki kol hamon hagashim. Another example is in Song of Songs 5:2. The sound of my beloved knocking, kol dodi dofek. Here the participle dofek, knocking, modifies dodi, my beloved. The participle isn't the main verb of the clause. In other words, Song of Songs 5:2 doesn't say, the voice of my beloved is knocking, but rather, the sound of my beloved who is knocking. And there are many more examples we could cite. One more, which is a lot like what we see in Psalm 29, comes from Isaiah 66:6. Kol sha'on me'ir, kol mehechal, kol Adonai, mushalem gemul de oyevav. A sound of tumult from a city, a sound from a temple, the sound of the Lord repaying his enemies. Again, this doesn't mean that the voice of the Lord is repaying his enemies, but rather the sound of the Lord repaying his enemies. It's a sentence fragment, an exclamation, and the participle modifies Adonai. It's not the predicate of Kol Adonai. We argue that this is the most likely interpretation of the grammar in Psalm 29, verses 3 to 7. Note that in these verses, the phrase Kol Adonai is never followed by a finite verb. In verses 3 to 4, it's followed by prepositional phrases, and in verse 5 and verse 7, it's followed by participles. This is exactly the kind of syntactic environment that we find when we look at other examples where Kol functions as a sentence fragment or an exclamation. This interpretation also makes better sense of some of these verses. What would it mean, for example, for the voice of the Lord to break cedars, or the voice of the Lord to hew with lightning bolts? It's better to understand the Lord himself as the agent of these actions. In verse 8 and verse 9, the phrase Kol Adonai is followed by finite verbs, and so it's more likely grammatically that in these instances the phrase is the subject of the clauses. This is also more likely in terms of meaning. Unlike verse 5a and verse 7, it makes sense to say that the thunderous voice of the Lord is shaking the wilderness, and that the thunderous voice of the Lord causes deer to give birth. We give this interpretation a B rating. If correct, then Psalm 29 is not so much about the voice of the Lord as it is about the Lord and the things that the psalmist hears the Lord doing. First, we hear him thundering against the waters. Then we hear him breaking down cedars and striking the mountains with lightning. Then we're told about the effects of these terrible sounds on the natural world. The wilderness shakes and the deer are forced into premature labor. This mention of deer in verse 9 brings us to our third issue, the meaning of verse 9a. Our interpretation of this clause is reflected in the translation of the ESV and others. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth. Some translations, however, say nothing about deer. For example, the RSV translates this verse as, the voice of the Lord causes the oaks to whirl. So is this clause about big trees whirling? Or is it about deer giving birth? And in either case, what would that mean? The issue is primarily a textual issue. The traditional Hebrew text reads, Kol Adonai Yecholel Ayalot. The word ayalot refers to female deer. And if we follow the traditional Hebrew text in reading the word deer, ayalot, then the whole clause most likely means the voice of the Lord causes deer to give birth, or at least that's how the majority of interpreters who followed the Masoretic text have interpreted it. Those who translate this clause as referring to oaks claim that the Masoretic pronunciation of the consonantal text is incorrect, and that the consonants aleph, yod, lamed, vav, tav should instead be pronounced elot, the plural of elah, which means oak tree. The argument for this view is simple. Such a slight change in the pronunciation of the consonantal text restores the synonymous parallelism in verse 9. Because verse 9b refers to forests, and because it's characteristic of Hebrew poetry for parallel lines to convey a similar image or idea, the word ayalot in verse 9a should be revocalized to elot, such that it refers to trees. There are several reasons, however, for following the vocalization of the Masoretic text. In the first place, nearly all of the ancient versions understood the word ayalot to refer to deer. This means that the Masoretic vocalization of this word, as ayalot, has very ancient roots, going back at least to the 2nd century BC. This doesn't mean it's correct, but it means it shouldn't be dismissed lightly. Furthermore, the combination of the noun ayalot, deer, and the verb chalal, give birth, occurs in Job 39:1. So in Job 39:1, God asks Job, Cholei ayalot tishmor, Job, have you watched deer giving birth? The same combination of deer and giving birth, which was apparently a poetic commonplace, probably occurs also in Psalm 29:9. Finally, an argument against the translation oaks is that it runs into a grammatical problem. The plural of elah is not elot, but elim, as in Isaiah 57:5, ba'elim, and Isaiah 61:3, ele hatzedek. Now, to be sure, there are issues with the translation deer as well. The strongest objection to this view is that the verb yecholel in the polel stem is not causative. It always means to give birth and never to cause to give birth. And this is true. Yet it doesn't follow that the word can't also mean to cause to give birth. And most Hebrew lexicons list both meanings as potential meanings of the verb, both to give birth and to cause to give birth. Another objection to this view is that it distorts the synonymous parallelism in verse 9. Deer is parallel to forest. Yet there are plenty of examples of line pairs that do not have neat synonymous relationships. There's nothing wrong or even unusual about having deer in one line and forests in which deer live in the next line. Furthermore, verse 9 doesn't consist of just these two lines. There is a third line, verse 9c, which says something altogether different. In his temple, everyone is saying glory. A final objection to this view is that it just doesn't make sense. What would it mean for the voice of the Lord to cause deer to give birth? In the ancient world, as in many parts of the world today, loud noises like thunder and stressful events were thought to send animals and humans into labor. For example, in 1 Samuel, when Phinehas' wife hears the news that her husband had died and the ark had been captured, she went into labor. Pliny, writing in the 1st century, writing in Greek, noted that claps of thunder caused sheep to miscarry when solitary. We might imagine a similar understanding behind verse 9a of Psalm 29. The thunderous voice of the Lord causes pregnant does to go into early labor. We give this interpretation a B rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The interpretation of verse 7 is crucial for understanding the message of the psalm. If we read it correctly as a description of hewing stone in the mountains, then verse 7 probably describes the Lord gathering material to build his temple. In the Baal myth, the god Baal defeats the sea and then builds his temple. In Psalm 29, the Lord, who is greater than Baal, thunders against the waters, verses 3 to 4, and then builds his temple from cedar and stone, verses 5 to 7. Throughout these verses 3 to 7, the focus is not on the Lord's voice per se, but on the Lord himself. The series of exclamations in these verses heighten the drama, and we're invited to listen as the Lord thunders against the waters, breaks down the cedars, and strikes the mountains with lightning bolts as he builds his temple. The sound of the Lord against the waters, the sound of the Lord breaking the cedars, the sound of the Lord hewing with lightning bolts. Verses 8 to 9 then describe how others respond to the Lord's thunderous sound or thunderous voice. The deer are sent into labor, the trees are stripped of their leaves, leaving no place for anyone to hide. Everything in the natural world is awestruck, and everyone in the heavenly world gathers together in the newly built temple to give glory to the Lord. This has been the top 3 exegetical issues for Psalm 29. Thanks for watching.